Quit hitting yourself! 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 Quit hitting yourself!
I can't do this just yet.
At least die with some flair. Resist the assault! Life is so brittle. Time to up this. Grasp your mortality tightly. Another challenger? Stalk and hunt. Grasp your mortality tightly. Twin terrors. Stalk and hunt. Oh, a glorious spectacle.
Hello. Today I will be talking about my Triple Counterattack Slayer build. This is the second time that I will be making a Triple Counterattack Slayer, as a little over a year ago in 3.17 I also made a kind of similar build, but back then I was mainly supplementing my main single target skill with the counterattacks, whereas now in 3.21 I am basing all my damage around the counterattacks. Due to the Crucible passive node that gives my counterattack damage 60% more damage, but at the cost of 30% cooldown recovery rate. Thus, in my head, this node is roughly giving me 1.5 links worth of damage. So if we add this amount of damage to my double Hungering Loop setups that I have for my Riposte and my Reckoning, these two counterattacks are roughly 6.5 link, and to top it off, my Vengeance, which is in my 6 link body armor, now is roughly a 7.5 link. Now, while this seems like a lot, we are still talking about counterattacks, and there is a reason why counterattacks are not meta. So, while counterattacks may not be super memeable, as since I've proven that it's actually a pretty viable build from my mapping showcases that I've shown, there is definitely a damage ceiling that you will be hitting. Counterattacks will not be getting to the 50, 100, 200 million DPS numbers. Additionally, the reasons I run double Hungering Loop is because I am very socket starved, as there are many auras that melee want to run, as I am currently running 8 of them. And in addition to that, Hungering Loop gives us 5 links, as you can put in 4 supports, whereas I would be forced to 4 link if I were to put them in my helm, gloves, or boot slots. Now, originally, this build was going to be a crit build, as I knew I was going to be limited on the damage ceiling of being counterattacks, but after doing some crafting and some tree pathing, I realized that if I were to go this route, I would not be able to achieve the 75 block that I have on both hits and spell hits. I would also have to give up a decent amount of AoE, and since I didn't want to give these up, crit is not the route that I went down, although if you wanted very high POB numbers for counterattacks, I think crit does have a higher damage ceiling, and getting the 50-50 block with versatile combatants should be fairly playable. So first I will go through my gear. So starting with the weapon, I chose to use a mace because I believe this build more or less needs to be using the Boneshatter skill, which requires an axe or a mace. The reason for this is because you will get in situations, especially if you're doing some bossing on this build, where you won't be getting hit very often, and Boneshatter is able to trigger your 6-link Vengeance in your chest, which is the counterattack that does the most damage out of all 3 of them. Thus, since we're using maces, I chose to craft on a Gavel, which is the slowest attack speed, thus has the highest flat damage numbers. This is important because attack speed is pretty much worthless on this build. Even though my mace has 2 rolls of attack speed does not give us any damage because our counterattacks do not scale at all with attack speed. The only reason I have attack speed is because there's really no other suffixes that are beneficial. Since we are not a crit build, I don't want any crit, and since we're using Forbidden Flame and Flesh jewels on Pain Forged from the Gladiator Ascendancy, which gives us 100% chance to deal double damage on counterattacks. Any double damage rolls on our weapon is also useless because we already have 100%. Thus, I settled for some attack speed just so that I can attack faster with Boneshatter, thus proccing my Vengeance a little bit more. And also, the attack speed is a somewhat quality of life since we move around with Shield Charge. The next item are gloves, which are Elder influenced for faster attacks. Again, for quality of life on my Boneshatter and Shield Charge. Since we don't currently have any mana leech on this build, and the mana regen we have is very low, I have Life Tap attached to my Shield Charge and Boneshatter, so that I can charge around whenever I want and not be limited on my mana. And my last gem is Blood Rage for, again, a little bit more attack speed for quality of life, and we are able to sustain frenzy charges while mapping with it. The next item is Belt, which really we just want the cooldown reduction, as since all of our damage comes from counterattacks, since counterattacks have cooldowns, cooldown recovery is basically a more multiplier. The next item are Boots, which we are just getting life and resist, but we get the cooldown recovery from the Eater implicit. The next item is the chest piece. The reason I went with this chest piece is because it's pretty hard to get, 75% spell block, thus the Eater implicit of a 10% perfect roll is very much needed, and in addition to this, we also have a 10% chance to block from a Veil Orb from June. The next items are, once again, our Hungering Loops. Now, in both our Hungering Loops, I put in Awaken Brutality because it's a really good damage multiplier, Awaken Melee Fizz, which is an extremely good multiplier since the less attack speed is not a downside, Impale, since we are an Impale build, and I have Maim in my Riposte so that I can keep the main buff on targets, as the main debuff makes them take additional physical damage. And in my Reckoning Hungry Loop setup, I have Pulverize, which once again is an extremely good link since the downside of less attack speed is nullified because triggers don't worry about attack speed. Now for my Vengeance, it's pretty much the same links as Reckoning since they are both trigger AoE skills, and that is Divergent Pulverize, which is an insane gem, giving us a 72% multiplier, which is disgusting. We again have Awaken Melee Fizz, Awaken Brutality, Cruelty, and Impale. The next item is, I believe, an item that is super underutilized, and that is In Presence, which is giving us a free double curse on enemies. And since Curse on Hit implicits were nerfed in the last patch, us being able to have free Blasphemy curses, and that being level 21 curses, gives us a ton of damage, with Vulnerability increasing our damage by roughly 15%, and Punishment giving us a roughly 10 to 15% more damage multiplier. Along with that, the Maddening Presence that we get after killing a rare or unique enemy is also extremely strong defensively, as it reduces the damage of enemies nearby by 10% and their attack speed by 10%, which is a pretty big defensive buff. Next is the Helm, Realm, which is basically giving us a ton of mana reservation. So we have 30% for Pride, 10% for everything on both the implicit and the explicit. And we want all this mana reservation because, like I said at the beginning, melee builds, and especially physical melee builds, have a ton of auras that you want to run, as they are extremely strong multipliers, ranging from 10 to 35% more damage multipliers. So I run Dread Banner, since we are a physical impale build. Again, we run Vulnerability on Blasphemy, we run Blood and Sand, we run Pride, which we have a double Pride Watcher's Eye, making Pride an insane damage multiplier. We run Punishment for free on our Blasphemy, we run Flesh and Stone, we run Determination, and to top it off, we run Tempest Shield to cap off our 75% spell block. Now, looking at our Crucible Trees, on my weapon, the first node is Fizz damage and reduce attack speed, which once again, we don't care about attack speed since counterattacks don't care about attack speed, so this node is all upside. The second node I have is worthless because we don't crit, so any crit nodes doesn't matter to us, and also attack speed doesn't matter to us, so there's not a lot of things that we want in the second node, so I chose to basically skip it, although if I was making a perfect weapon, there are some nodes that are fairly useful. Our third node is 15% Fizz damage, which is really, really good. And our fourth node is 15% cooldown recovery rate, which again is really good, since all of our damage comes from counterattacks that have cooldowns on it. And our Crucible Tree for our shield is the first node is Life, which this node can be pretty much anything. Our second node is Chance to Block, which there are lots of different block nodes that you could use for this. I just have the 6. The third node is Chance to Avoid Shock, which we are combining with Storm Shroud to make us completely ailment immune. And then the fourth node, which I talked about, is the Counterattack node, which is giving us 60% more damage, which the build is revolved around. As for Flasks, I run the Lion's Roar, as it gives us 10% more damage, but also the knockback is actually fairly strong as a defensive mechanic for mapping. The next flask is a Basalt Flask, which gives us movement speed and more armor, which we are lacking a little bit on the Fizz mitigation, which is why I use this. We use a Silver Flask for the mobility that it gives, and also has an increased armor roll. We have a Quicksilver for more movement speed and all elemental resist, so that I am over resist cap for elemental weakness maps. And lastly, if you are fairly wealthy, you can run a Progenesis, which is giving us chaos resist cap and a fairly large max hit damage mitigation. If you are more on a budget, you can just use this slot for a life flask. And the reason I don't use a life flask here is because I choose to get all my reactive healing from Enduring Cry, which, since we have a decent amount of cooldown reduction, is up every 5 seconds, and it gives me 2000 life, which is a good enough life flask for me. But also, Enduring Cry gives me an additional 6% reduced physical damage taken, which is very helpful. And in addition to staying alive with Enduring Cry, I also run Molten Shell. And the last thing I will talk about in terms of gear and gem is Phase Run. So Phase Run is a little bit interesting, as it can be either extremely strong in some cases or extremely bad in others. So interestingly, Phase Run, for some reason, gives a 30% more melee physical damage buff, and since our counterattacks do not cancel the duration of Phase Run, we are able to keep up this 30% more multiplier if we wanted to. Now, this is pretty OP, assuming nothing else changes, but the reason I say it's bad in some cases is because since our build is made to be hit a lot, the invisibility portion of Phase Run is a pretty significant downsize unless you are guaranteed to be getting hit a ton of times, even during the invisibility buff. So basically how I would use Phase Run is in super juiced content. For example, when I was running 100% Delirium, I noticed that when spamming Phase Run, I was equivalently clearing as well as not phase running, but I was way safer, as I would say I was roughly taking 50% less damage, since there are so many fewer targets actually targeting my character. But since there are so many mobs on the screen, as there are hundreds of mobs around me, even though I was phase run, there would still be 20 to 30 mobs still attacking me. Thus, my trigger rate was still high. Thus, in these super juice scenarios, I think phase run is just a straight up more multiplier for this build. But in pretty much any other scenario, phase run is a DPS downgrade. It can still be used for utility, to run through frost walls, or to dodge mechanics, but I thought that was some interesting tech to throw into the build. So if you have any comments, questions, put them in the comments, and I'll get to them. Thanks.